interested. It really started with Boston teachers interested in ethnic studies and bringing that to Boston. And there are many people in the room tonight, actually, that will be speaking that were part of that. And what we'll be sort of doing is giving space for folks tonight to reflect a little bit on so far the ethnic studies journey so far, these past couple of years, and especially a year where we've been pretty active, and some thinking about moving forward. Like, what does that mean moving forward? So if it's okay, what I'm going to do is actually, because we did share a little bit in the beginning, we'll maybe skip this part. Does that feel right? And so we got a little space to share in the earlier part. But really wanted to introduce some folks that will be speaking tonight and doing some reflection tonight. We have Jeremy Aponte from the Umano Academy, Amrita Dani from Bata, Mecca McGuire, who is a community partner in the Black Studies Collective, and then Gabby Robledo, who's at the Tobin K-8. All three people have really been, all four people really have been involved a lot in sort of like the different aspects of ethnic studies in Boston for a while now, in various ways. We're really just asking for folks to sort of have a space tonight, and then have all of us be a fly on the wall to listen about some reflections on ethnic studies in Boston. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing, and then we'll just like pin those people. I think that'd be the easiest thing to do. I'll just have folks start by, if you can just first introduce yourself. And so really the first question is about who you are and sort of your role, real quick. I know some of you did that in your intro, but even more so, like your personal stake in ethnic studies, for example, your story, and how did you get involved in the ethnic studies movement in Boston? And so maybe just start by that, and have the panelists sort of just talk through that. So Jeremy, we're gonna start with you. Is that okay?
Sure. So, I don't know in terms of story, but really, I think to be as brief as possible. Essentially, um, I think, I mean, really, the reason why I have come to the city of Boston and been here for probably a little over a decade at this point was for the purpose of pursuing ethnic studies. I grew up in the state of Arizona essentially for most of my life. Towards I think the end of my stay in Arizona was when the ban took place and a lot of the political action surrounding the ban of ethnic studies took place. And yeah, my kind of like pathway into education had a lot to do essentially with the mission of ethnic studies and finding a place where that was a possibility. Um, and yeah, Boston really happened to kind of be the place where things worked out, where it was able to be possible. And really, after it was kind of like looking within the district and trying to find connections to other people interested in similar things, which was difficult in of itself, I think. Um, but yeah, I mean, I've been involved with the BTU group, kind of joining on what Natalia started with a group of people previously, and then I think maybe through that, I connected with folks in the social studies department, things like that, just to kind of see what was going on, what's out there, and then eventually got involved with the curriculum writing group, and that's kind of like what really solidified things for me in terms of working towards ethnic studies, and even the position that I have now, teaching fifth and sixth ethnic studies, which is kind of like a rare thing in terms of the city of Boston. The position was kind of built really off of like advocacy of certain individuals at my school, obviously myself included, and also on that work that we had started on trying to develop a ninth grade curriculum. I don't know if that's sufficient or not, Katie. Let me know if there's something else you want me to talk about, but that's kind of the story, I think, in a briefest possible sense.
Well, good. We're just getting our feet wet. Amrita, do you want to introduce yourself? Tell a little bit about your story and how you got involved.
Sure. Hey everyone. Like I said, my name is Amrita. I'm a teacher at Boston Adult Technical Academy, and I think so. I kind of got involved in ethnic studies primarily through having connections and relationships with other teachers. So I have been very lucky at my school at Bata um, to work on a team of teachers who really embody, I think, a lot of what ethnic studies pedagogy is and a lot of what the values are of ethnic studies. Of social justice, of student activism and teacher activism, of understanding ourselves and our stories, and building community. And when I started teaching there, I felt very much that my background, which had primarily been my exposure to ethnic studies, has been at college, at the university level, more academic, more theoretical. I felt like I was just like vastly unprepared to do the kind of teaching that my colleagues were doing. Um, I was very lucky to be able to learn from them. So over the past, 5 or 6 years that I've been teaching, I've been able to learn from just, working alongside my coworkers. But I also wanted to be able to get a grounding myself, and so I started looking through our union for other teachers who were already engaged in this work. I met Natalia, I met some other teachers who had been starting to organize for ethnic studies in the district, and that I just really that really appealed to me, and I wanted to jump into both learning how to teach ethnic studies and kind of flexing my organizing muscle to try to really make it happen, and recognizing that the only way we're going to get ethnic studies in our district is to fight for it, because there's no way that the system we live in, the capitalist racist system that we live in, is going to hand us the education that we need to dismantle it. That's not happening. So we're going to have to fight for it, and that, I think, is what brought me into this community of teachers as well. Did I answer the question?
Yeah.
Great.
Mecca, can I ask you to share?
Yeah, sure. So like I said in my introduction, I'm part of the Black Studies curriculum group. And I kind of came to ethnic studies through, I'm actually not from here, I'm from Central Appalachia. And so I've been doing education work outside of Boston for longer, but just being able to engage with Black and Afro-descended children around ethnic studies, using ethnic studies, but specifically like Black studies frameworks to talk about different issues, but also to use it as a way to have more creative expression, do out of school art education, community projects, as well as like community political engagement projects that I think contribute to the larger vision of, autonomy, humanizing engagement, but also I think that specifically when it comes to like how I am here in the space of Boston, is that there is a type of, I would say, deficit around the engagement that is occurring with Black and Afro-descended children. And so the space that I work in terms of like being a school partner, last site that I was at the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. School in Intervale and Dorchester, is that there is a role that ethnic studies and specifically using Black studies frameworks can be used to like do across the diaspora engagement, not just being African Americans, but our Caribbean and South and Central American community members who normally would sort of get flooded out in terms of how our normal like diversity initiatives and multicultural engagement strategies that have been used are deployed. So does that answer it? Is that okay?
Yeah, I think so. And then Gabby, can you have you share?
Yeah, so I'm also not from BPS originally. I attended the California public school system growing up. And an example I always think of about like the amount of work that needs to be done in the curriculum there is that a huge third grade standard is the study of California missions. So a year-long study of like recreating the missions and building models and going on field trips there and learning about them, but it's actually just like a study of colonialism because it's like the Spanish people trying to convert Native Americans into Catholicism, right? And I didn't realize that then, but like looking back and reflecting on some of those curriculum, that was missing an important piece of identity and like not at all efficient. And in 5th grade, I read Esperanza Rising, which is about like a Mexican American girl living in Central California. And that was the first time that I actually saw like my identity reflected in the book. And I still remember that to this day. So it just is like an example of how important it is to learn about your own identity in school. And so this year I started looking for like ways for just resources on how to teach elementary students ethnic studies. And it's really difficult because I found that a lot of the stuff online is catered to older students, so middle school or high school. So I found this group and I did the PLC last summer, and I've tried to attend the planning meetings to learn how to better teach ethnic studies, because I think maybe not BPS, but specifically my school, like we are told to teach not ethnic studies in general, but anytime like AAPI month or Latinx Heritage Month or Black History Month, we're like told to teach about these groups of people, but not given any resources. And I think a lot of the staff at my school feel like underprepared but pressured to teach. But I think I've gotten a lot of resources from this group and it's been really helpful. So I like recommend teachers at my school to join or to come to meetings. Does that summarize it?
Yeah.
Okay.
So this next section, I'm going to ask the question, but I'm actually going to pin all of you, the folks who are on the panel tonight. I'm just going to add spotlights to all of you, just so you're not shocked that your face is all of a sudden large on the screen. But and it's really for anyone, really. So feel free to sort of be in conversation with each other and feel free to sort of add on to each other's ideas. But I shared a little bit earlier sort of about the vision and framework that Boston the Ethnic Studies, and I'm curious about how you personally define it, especially within that framework or against that framework. So I'm curious about how you define it and why you think it's necessary, right? So Gabby, you talked a little bit about that, but I'm curious about why, and feel free to sort of interweave your own personal story into that too.
I guess an important aspect I would say is identity work and making sure that ethnic studies reflects the identities of the people that are taking the course or learning the ethnic studies. And this is really different in like Boston, because depending on what school you teach at or what neighborhood you're at, the identities of the students will look a little bit different. But I just think that especially in like academic, students are way more invested when they see themselves in the material that is like maybe not math and science, that's a little bit harder, but humanities and history and English, they're more, at least my students in like my class are also more likely to like be excited about the stories if the characters reflect them, and be excited about what we are learning if they see themselves in the books, as opposed to like, I can think of like me in high school reading Great Gatsby and all those books and not really knowing what they were even about. Shakespeare, like just confused. So I think that it's important for engagement for students and that ethnic studies reflects their identities.
Yeah, I can jump in, and I definitely agree with you, Gabby, what you were saying about students kind of having their identity reflected in stories. And I think part of that is also like taking, for me, ethnic studies is also like taking like power analysis to that. So like not only, telling your story or seeing your story or learning histories of like oppressed people, but analyzing it and understanding, right, like who holds power, how do they maintain their power, how do they maintain their control over oppressed people, and then also how do people resist historically in a variety of ways, and how can you resist, right? I think what I've heard from, so a lot of the students at my school have been through BPS and have had really negative or disengaging experiences with school. And if we don't like tackle that right at the beginning of the year, and have students both tell the stories of, or write the stories, or personally reflect, right, on like what their past experiences have been with school, and then understand and analyze like what is it about school that is so oppressive and controlling? Like in what ways does school exist to replicate, right, like social order, and keep people kind of in their place, right? And so when students can kind of see like, okay, what happened to me was really unjust and unfair, but also, it's connected to what's happening to other people, and it's connected to a system. That to me is what ethnic studies is. It's putting that story in context, and then kind of having the knowledge to then understand other people's stories as well.
I can just jump in because I feel like it ties directly into what Amrita is talking about around power, but also I guess for me, ethnic studies, and I guess the way that I like to engage with it is also like as a type of like intervention to like humanize engagement with children of color, but also like on top of using the race, ethnicity as a way to like analyze and look at power, look at structures, look at ourselves. I think that the humanizing part, at least just for me, is really important because, a lot of children have these really carceral, violent, and isolated experiences, or they feel isolation in school systems. And we see the statistics, we see the numbers, we see all of the things that come out of, specifically with Black and Afro-descended children, their experiences with schooling. And so I feel like ethnic studies, when done ideally, is a type of intervention into that, and like centering the whole entire human, the whole entire like experience, not replicating harm, but like learning and engaging together in a way that is not replicating the systems that are actively like oppressing, harming, all of those things.
Jeremy, you feel like you want to add anything to that?
I mean, just to clarify, like in terms of like how we define it or the purpose of ethnic studies.
Both, right?
Both.
Either one, if you want to answer.
I mean, to not like repeat essentially what's already been said, I think like trying to like kind of shrink it down to something essential, it's always a challenge. But recently, I think not that recently, several months ago, I had watched this conversation between Robin D.G. Kelley and Fred Moten, and they were talking about Black studies specifically, and kind of like ultimately, what is the mission of Black studies, and kind of the way Fred Moten put it is simply that the not exclusive mission of Black studies is to save the earth. So again, essentially, like this is a framework I think that is in its DNA, it's anti-capitalist. And it really provides kind of like the radical possibility to be able to save the earth in ways that our other subjects are not built for, not designed for, within this, within this context of the Anthropocene or white supremacist capitalism, all that other stuff. So, I mean, that's kind of what I stick with. I just say the Fred Moten version from now on. When it's like, what's the point of Black studies? It's to save the earth at the end. That's it. But yeah, in addition to everything else everybody else shared, that's how I would put it into context. Why it's important, because that's the radical potential of ethnic studies, Black studies, is to save everybody. So yeah, that's where I'm at with it.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. So lots of you talked about, like things that are in some ways feels insurmountable, like save the earth, or like, or, it's like looking at power, connecting that with structures, right? So like that feels in some ways kind of, I mean, I can imagine there are many people in the audience right now that are thinking, well, I want to teach ethnic studies. I think I want to teach ethnic studies. And wondering like, what would it take, right? Like, what are the shifts? what are the ways in which we'd have to shift the way that we teach and learn? Like, what does it actually look like when I'm in front of a bunch of young people? And so I'm just curious about what kinds of shifts that you feel like you've made in your teaching, or what shifts, what would you say is like things that you've done in your teaching or done with young people that actually exemplify what you think ethnic studies is?
I feel like also too, just moving beyond looking at ethnic studies as like history and like as like subject matter courses, and thinking of it as a type of lens that we are learning and teaching together, like co-creating together in our individual classroom learning community spaces. And I think for me specifically, like again, like I can only specifically talk about how like I'm relating from this like standpoint, is that an analysis of racial capitalism, but also like how racial capitalism and colonialism comes into the classroom is something that I think that ethnic studies frameworks, Black studies contends with. I think that, you know, the average, I know that the big, you know, statistic is that, you know, BPS is majority Black and Latino, but I think that when, or just myself as like a Black educator, when I come into spaces and BPS, a lot of times like the Latino part, like again, not a race, but like using Latino as like a race to discuss like classroom demographics, school demographics, more often than not, we're talking about a wider expansion of the Black diaspora. We're talking about the African diaspora. So as a Black educator, when I come into these spaces, you know, I feel like when you approach ethnic studies from a perspective of like, we're going to talk about, you know, the bus boycotts, or we're going to talk about something that has to do with African American history because it's February, or we just approach it as like a history course, that we also don't contend with the fact that a lot of times we have a lot of different colonial histories in the classroom. And when we center like these ethnic studies frameworks, examining racial capitalism, examining the relationship of colonialism, Orientalism, all of these structures, we're also contending with the fact that like a Dominican, a Puerto Rican, a Cape Verdean, you know, Brazilian, Central American children who are from Honduras, the whole entire spectrum that we might also see that might be encapsulated in language like Latinidad, also are a part of the African diaspora, and like centering that as a way where we can like come to some sort of like common understanding. So for example, like I mostly do work with younger elementary school students. And so a lot of times people kind of feel like Black studies, ethnic studies isn't something that you can approach with young students. But to me, like if I'm working in Dorchester and Roxbury, like you might have a whole entire classroom space that is technically Latino, but like my first unifying, you know, engagement is going to be around, let's say, the African diaspora. But how do we approach those types of things without causing, you know, all of the ripples that come up with like engaging Blackness in a classroom of who knows what people are bringing to the table? Like, to me, I think that like, for example, like I've done activities specifically like around science, earth science, things like that, that might not necessarily seem like they are ethnic studies or Black studies, but rather than being like Black people made this, you know, it's also like a shift in teaching where we're going to like actually place ourselves on the map. And like maybe instead of using just like their history with absolutely like no personal connections, we can use something neutral, like, I don't know, foodways, and like using things like foodways to like actually create personal connections with things like ecology, botany, earth science. So that way, you know, we're having a conversation about the Black diaspora, but we have a whole entire spectrum of kids who have all kinds of different colonial relationships with the one thing that unifies us together, which oftentimes is Blackness, the African, diaspora. But now we're creating like this sort of like connection that isn't going to like spark whatever, back to that harm, back to replicating that harm. So I think that just like keeping in mind that a lot of our students come from like different colonial realities and different colonial backgrounds is a really important thing for me, at least in terms of shifting the way that I do engagement around ethnic studies.
Yeah, Mecca, one thing you're talking about that I feel definitely feel resonated with me was just this idea that like students are essentially like in different and I think adults too, I think this is an important part of it, right? Is like we're all in different stages of like developing our consciousness and our analysis of ourselves in the world. Um, I think like understanding that ethnic studies isn't, it's not going to be as simple as like, okay, like we're going to talk about race today, and in like 3 weeks when we're done with this unit, everyone's going to be at the same understanding of like race, racialization, and like how their own experience is tied into like the history of scientific racism or whatever. Like that's not gonna, it doesn't really work that way, and it doesn't work that way for us either, right? As adults or yeah, or quote unquote experts. So that has been a shift for me, I think, in how I approach teaching, um, teaching in general, I guess, but especially teaching ethnic studies, where something that has been very valuable for me is going through the ethnic studies professional like learning community stuff for teachers and having to actually examine my own identity as an Asian American, as someone who identifies as like an Asian in America, right? And it's explicitly understanding the like that neocolonialism, colonialism, imperialism has a lot to do with like why I'm here, right? So so for me, like delving into that and also just examining, you know, my relationship to my own family has helped me, I think, be better at supporting my students as they go through that same process. Because what I feel like the big things that have come up this year that I think I maybe anticipated were challenges, but I didn't anticipate the level of the challenge is for some of my students, right? A big part of ethnic studies is connecting to your community or connecting to your family. And I've had so many students who have like really complicated relationships with their family. And so navigating that and understanding like, okay, are there things that ethnic studies can actually help you build relationships with people, or help you process things that have happened to you, or your parents or your family's experience or your, you know, your community's experience. And understanding that that process is different for every student, that has been really critical. Because I think if you're too rigid about like how students develop their consciousness, if we try to apply like a mass framework of, you know, whatever development to ethnic studies, it doesn't really work, because it's not, that's first of all like not very humanizing to begin with, and second of all, like that's not really how consciousness develops. Like we don't understand the world. We don't go from like not understanding anything to being able to read the world in like a minute. It's a process, and it's like cyclical, which I think is yeah, it's a challenge of teaching, because you kind of want everybody to leave with having, you know, like learned a specific thing or be at a specific place.
I think that's especially interesting, Amrita, what you're saying, what you're bringing up, because I think I've been asked in various contexts, even like, what does it mean for ethnic studies to have like assessments and to have like standards and to have, you know, like all that stuff that talks about like, have you arrived, you know? And it feels like it's very counter to what you're talking about how we'll spend a lifetime of unpacking what happens to us every single day. Gabby and Jeremy, you have other things to add about like how, you know, the frames of ethnic studies are just teaching in this way really shifts the way that, you know, maybe that's how you enter teaching, but maybe shifted the way you taught and also maybe it's different than the person next to you in the classroom, like another classroom next to you is teaching.
I guess you mentioned that when you said unpacking what's happening on a regular basis, and like Amerta, where you were talking about how it's like everyone goes at their own pace. I think something that's shifted in how I taught is like talking about current events. And I think if you're unpacking on a regular basis, then obviously what's going on in the world has something to do with that. And I used to be one of those teachers that was like, I'm not gonna touch this. They don't even like know what's going on outside of their house, like thinking like the news. But this year, like, I don't even start that conversation. If I know something has happened, I will bring it up and I will ask, did anybody watch the news? And everyone's hand shoots up. And so I guess I'm more aware that like they are more aware of politics than I thought that they were. And so if we're unpacking regularly, then that comes into play and it's part of like the conversation, even though it may not be like in the curriculum flow, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it seems like there's a dynamic there that you're insinuating, that there's like a teacher unpacking and student unpacking all at the same time, right? Like, and it throws the dynamic of teacher versus student, like teacher over student. It's like we're all trying to unpack, trying to unlearn, right?
Mhm.
I know, Jeremy, you've been like trying to do this ethnic studies. It's been hard because structurally it's hard, but I think I'm curious about like, because you weren't always teaching ethnic studies, right? You were told to teach, you were like a elementary school teacher at one point, right? And I'm wondering if there was a shift even in teaching a class that was labeled ethnic studies. Was there a shift for you, or do you feel like you approached it in a similar way then as when you taught before?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot to think about. I mean, for me too, like I'm also, it's not like I teach high school students. I teach, people that are 9, 10, 11, 12 years old. So my context has always been kind of like radically different from really a lot of spaces where Black studies, ethnic studies takes place. And I would say that I think one of the things that I think definitely changes too is I think the sort of like emphasis on really like building relationships in ways that I think sometimes for elementary teachers a little bit more natural, because you do sometimes spend so much time with children, like literally from like 7 in the morning to 2 in the afternoon, that those relationships are things that you're able to kind of cultivate to a much deeper degree throughout the year. But I mean, I guess maybe it's normal for people that teach kind of like, they teach like like U.S. History 1 or something, and they see a different group of students for like an hour, each day or something like that. But I really kind of had to shift over to, I mean, in general, like switching up, like kind of what I do, what I emphasize, the pace that we go at, even kind of like really cultivating a classroom space where, even though to me it feels like we have a limited amount of time together, to a much more extreme degree than like my elementary spaces, that we're able to get into deeper, more personal subjects, or things that can be potentially difficult to struggle through in terms of material. But yeah, it's a lot. I mean, it's a big shift. I think too, honestly, that it can be a little bit scary too to really get into doing ethnic studies, especially at the stage where we're at in the city of Boston, because we do have kind of like our own like independent support network, really, but administrators don't know what you're doing. Your teachers oftentimes in your buildings have no idea what you're doing. And also, like, honestly, it's like, like sometimes you don't feel like you know what you're doing. You know what I mean? Like it's one of these constant struggles where it's like I'm doing something that has this huge importance. Like, I'm holding this like uh, you know, um, discipline up by myself, and um, essentially it's like being afraid to fail. I think like that's like a real thing with like kind of switching over to like doing ethnic studies in name, and not just kind of altering classroom practices to kind of fit the framework. I mean, but yeah, I mean, for me, it's like, I think, I don't know, honestly, I feel like my whole, like everything kind of switched up too with the pandemic, because it's like a lot of the things that I think about our job that is honestly ridiculous, as like public school teachers or classroom teachers kind of like fades away, where it's like, what is it really about ultimately when we have like students struggling with, you know, eviction, food, all these other things on top of that. It's like, this doesn't matter. The MCAS don't matter. The scores don't matter. Your evaluation don't matter. Like at the end of the day, like these relationships are what's more important than everything else, essentially. And also that we really have the ability to, you know, survive essentially in these situations. So I mean, I don't know. I don't know if I'm ever gonna be the same after this year, because like I straight up just don't care about a lot of the stuff that public schools and institutions consider important. I just don't care no more. I don't care about the MCAS. You couldn't make me care about an assessment if you tried at this point. Like I'm 100% good on it. You know, I'm here for the kids, I'm here for the people, and I'm looking to have a good time. I'm definitely not worried about, you know, what the grades are looking like at the end of the day. That's definitely not my like badge of honor. But for sure, I mean, it's tough. Like honestly, like, you know, without being profane or anything, like my attitude is just kind of like know what's important and stick with that. Because honestly, like we're in institutions that even if they did do a better job of kind of like institutionalizing ethnic studies, they still wouldn't get it. And you have to understand too that ultimately it's on you. You're going to be the expert. You know, you're the one who's often going to have to like, you know, cultivate the resources, build the materials. You can't do what you did before and depend upon a social studies department for resources or an ELA department for resources or, you know, your advisor, administrator. You got to be, you know, a little bit more self-sufficient, but you also got to build community in other spaces that are not institutional. And that's kind of what we did, honestly. Like we have, you know, at this point, like with Katie, we have kind of like an institutional presence, but still a lot of this work is outside of the, you know, the web of BPS. But
Yeah, that leads us really right into the next question about sort of the movement of ethnic studies in Boston. I'm also reminded, Jeremy, of what you're saying of, you know, like just thinking about assessments and how they just don't match with this kind of teaching, right? And I was just recently in a space where a friend of mine said, you know, what would it mean if we measured student success by how well we take care of each other, right? What if that was the measure? Take care of each other and take care of the earth, right? Like, what if that was the measure? If that was a measure, then, you know, this individual achievement stuff of like, you know, one person getting, you know, the good grades and, you know, accelerating and, you know, wouldn't matter, you know, like that stuff wouldn't matter. It would be about our relationships with each other and the earth, right? So I'm curious about sort of, you know, Jeremy kind of mentioned this about like, you know, having to sort of do this in a fugitive space, right? In a space where it's not going to be institutionalized really in the way that, I mean, we know the origins of ethnic studies doesn't come from institutions, right? It comes from people demanding, it's going to be for us, by us, and about us, right? And so I'm curious about like, what is it meant to be? What is it meant to you? What it has meant to you to be either personally part of this sort of like this community of people in Boston that are doing this work? Has it changed the way you move through the world? Has it changed the way that you think about sort of your teaching? And, you know, because teaching can often be like isolating, right? People often talk about teaching being very isolating. So I'm curious about what your take is on like being a part of this community, being part of this sort of movement in Boston around ethnic studies, and what it means to you.
I guess I'll just hop right in. I think that specifically coming from the South, we have, I think just building that community and interpersonal relationships means so much. So like actually having relationships, you know, with parents that are bigger than just like what happens in the school building. I think for me, especially because I'm not a classroom teacher and I come to like ethnic studies, I come to Black studies as a person who is like already kind of like outside of the structure, the work has always kind of been fugitive. I think also to having to work in this dynamic of relying on the community and relying on like what parents, what students, and what the larger community is asking for has been really, really important for me, specifically because I'm not from here. And I think in terms of like what it means to be like a part of like a larger, you know, ethnic community, Black community in the city of Boston, is that it means that like you don't just teach and go home, like you have actual, you know, obligations and you have commitments that you have to keep to a larger, you know, swath of people. And so I think that for me, it's also illuminated just how dire it is that we have some sort of space and some sort of language to really like begin to like talk about what's happening in our lives, in our communities, and in the classroom, and tie those things together. Because I see personally, whenever I come into these spaces, is that, you know, I am looking at a larger diasporic community who's kind of been like disregarded by these bigger institutions, whether it be BPS, whether it be, you know, public schools, housing facilities, or housing department, all of those things. And so to me, I think that like it's also meant that like I have to change a lot of the ways that like I even relate to community, and like, you know, be more directly involved and be more directly relational, which isn't necessarily hard, because I think where I come from, that's like a type of cultural value that, I mean, I don't think is necessarily not in the Northeast, but it just looks a little bit differently. But yeah, I think that also too, understanding that this larger diaspora doesn't really have the same type of like nobody's gonna build out things that are gonna like represent the spectrum of the African diaspora. That has to be something that we do, because that is like directly in opposition to a lot of the agendas of the public school system. But we would have to completely and totally like rehabilitate like all of the language, all of the curriculum. And that's not something that these institutions are really, really, truly, truly interested in. And so I think that like in terms of like fugitivity, it's really, really important to like always keep it directly with the people, the community, and like who those people are and what they want.
If you need a reminder, the questions around sort of the movement in Boston, being a part of the community here, what has that meant for you to be a part of that while also teaching?
I think that being part of the ethnic studies group and movement has made me closer to students and their families. And part of that might also be the pandemic, but I think that a lot of the work that we did at the beginning of the year, like getting to know you, and a lot of my students in SEI are recent immigrants to the country. So a lot of what they're excited about talking about is like their home countries and their culture and the food. And a lot of their families were also very excited about, like, I guess I'm trying to say they got involved in the academic work, which has never really happened in my classroom before. So students would ask their parents about like their grandparents and blah, blah. And so parents would like come to my Zoom and share out. And this year, more than ever before, actually, it's never happened before, but like families will invite me over for food. And like I've hung out with students outside of school, which I've never done before. So I think overall, it's gotten me to get to know families and students on like a more personal level. And that as a result, obviously, great relationships with parents helps with teaching. And so it's all around been like a great experience in terms of having a stronger community within my classroom, my students within themselves, and me with the families. And that hasn't really happened in previous years because parents aren't excited about like math standards as much as they are about talking about like Puerto Rico, or obviously.
Don't feel like you have to all answer. I just wanted to give space for folks if they want to answer that question.
I can jump in just kind of a couple of things that I'm like trying to keep track of the things I wanted to that question made me think about was, I think one thing just in my classroom that has been really great is kind of like what we've been talking about, right? Is like, because we're not it's not like the sense of like standards and linear progression for students. I feel like I've been able to have a lot of like conversations with students like um that are real and that are about the issues that like I I think are important to talk about, right? So like it's instead of like trying to find a way to have a conversation with a student that like covers whatever content we have to teach them, or like um trying to force a connection to a book that we're reading or something. It feels a little more natural and authentic to be able to, within the ethnic studies curriculum, have conversations about, whether it is about students' relationships with their family or their history, right? Like their understanding of the history of the places they come from, or as they learn new history, what they're thinking about it, or as they talk to community members or talk to examine, like histories of activism. Just the conversations that I've been able to have with students more one-on-one, I feel like are just better, and I feel more focused on like being in the moment in those conversations than like how I'm going to get the student to like do their work so that they get their whatever, pass this exam or whatever, write this essay. So that I think has been really helpful and meaningful to me just in building community with students and in my classroom. But then in the broader kind of movement, I guess, or the ethnic studies now kind of community, a couple of things I guess kind of stand out to me. First of all, I think it's really useful that we actually don't focus too much in our organizing on trying to convince people in power that ethnic studies will be good for graduation rates and good for test scores and good for like external outcomes. And I think that's important. I think it's important that we don't kind of like give in to the pressure to explain ethnic studies within the framework of like how public education and education in this country in general operates. Yeah, and I think part of the reason we have honestly the capacity to do that is because of the past year, and specifically the mass protests against police brutality after the murder of George Floyd set up Boston public schools to take on this like anti-racism, right? And kind of like do it in a way that I think all of us in ethnic studies and in these spaces would critique and would have like concerns about, like I certainly have a lot of concerns about the way anti-racism as a concept has been like implemented in Boston public schools, without changing like the underlying structures. But I think having the ethnic studies community has given me like space to actually talk about that, right? And like understand what is it about the way BPS is approaching anti-racism that actually is super surface, right? Or like doesn't really address the core issues of either racial injustice or economic injustice or or anything substantive. Sorry, I'm like losing steam a little bit, guys. Let's stop now.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing maybe I'll add that's just not like, again, just not to echo what everybody already said, but I feel like part of it, I mean, I could look at it from even kind of like whatever, like you know, um I look at it as a piece too of like the involvement in ethnic studies, really building a community, as well, and a network of people that are, deeply invested essentially in an alternative. I think that's like the big thing that I think for me has been helpful, is that like when you can kind of like struggle with something that's unknown, like which I mean really for ethnic studies, honestly, like that's what it is. It's like we're trying to essentially do something that um doesn't necessarily have precedence in a lot of ways. I think you could think of like, oh, well, you know, Arizona had programs, or they have programs on the West Coast, or this school, that school, whatever. But I think ethnic studies, Black studies, whatever, I mean, it's essentially always kind of like, you know, a space where imagination, alternatives are always possible. And we've been, I mean, really, like, even with the Black Studies Collective, it's like, you know, building something that doesn't exist, you know, like, you know, writing units on things that are our wildest dreams, like talking about political prisoners in an education space, things like that. Like, it's just, it's not trying to figure out what's already been done and doing it, which is what teaching really boils down to a lot of times, being given something and making it accessible. It's like actually creating our own spaces. And I mean, struggling through that together with people, I think has been something that's been like special for me in terms of like, I think maybe like providing a deeper purpose to like why we do education work, or what are the possibilities essentially. Um, I think those things are important as well. Like, you know, I think a lot of like I'd say like my closest like allies or comrades and like the teacher, you know, education or Boston community have been like built through like the last few years. And even from my analysis and my learning has like grown. You know, I've probably like learned more in the last 3 or 4 years than I have in like 15. You know what I mean? So I think there's just really unlimited potential with this in ways that it's not going to happen if you wait for like, you know, Pearson to like make the book, or like, you know, give you the materials or the binder and shit like that. Like, you really have to be able to imagine things and, you know, want to be together in community with people also imagining things. So that's the only thing I'm going to add on to that, I guess.
Yeah, thanks. I think, you know, one of the principles that we have in ethnic studies is that we got to build it ourselves too. It's not just fighting, right? Not just fighting, kind of like what Amrita was saying, not just convincing people in power that we need this. It's that we got to build some of this ourselves, because it is this alternative that doesn't really exist, right? And so we don't know what it looks like. Then how can we get other people to tell us what it looks like? You know, like, it doesn't make any sense, right? We gotta imagine it for ourselves. Yeah, I think like even this space of like folks in the room is like, it's been so relational, right? Like, people will say, like, when we first started getting involved in Boston and reaching out to folks in other cities, like, the answer was always ethnic studies is relational, right? That's the bottom line. It's relational, right? So it's not just about a curriculum. It's not just about something that's placed on you. It's relational. So I'm curious, this is the last question that we have, and then sort of open it up. We don't have to stay until 7. It's not, you know, just because we said that we will be open to 7 doesn't have to stay there. But the last question is really an open question. It's, you know, all of you have been involved in ethnic studies and Black studies, and, you know, various these pockets of folks who are creating these alternatives and thinking about reimagining what this looks like in Boston. And you know, whether through its developing curriculum or teaching or, you know, implementing ethnic studies, whatever that means in your space. And there are probably some things that you know now that you didn't really know when we first started in the space. And I'm curious about what are some of those things for you. Feel free to sort of like talk about challenges that you've had or anticipated, and then how to move forward too. But just really about what do you know now that you didn't know, right? So even Jeremy saying like, oh, like 3 years ago, you know, I thought learned is like so many things in the last 3 years versus the 15. Like, what are some of those things that you've learned?
I guess this one's kind of silly, but I don't think it's kind of like a secret maybe, but like I feel like in general, especially in COVID, like my administrator hasn't been anywhere near my classroom in months. And so just realizing, I think that we have a lot more power to say what we believe in our classroom than I think sometimes. I think there is a lot of fear, and a lot of it is justified, right? I think there are absolutely retaliatory principles. There have been, you know, obvious many cases of teachers coming under fire for expressing their political beliefs and their, you know, like having an ideology, which like everyone has an ideology, like school has an ideology, but if you're not espousing like a capitalist ideology and like a white supremacist ideology or a colonial ideology, then like it feels it is subversive. And I think one thing I've kind of learned this year is that like no one from BPS is going to like shut off my Zoom because I say the word capitalism. Or I have a student be like, who has power in this scenario? White people, right? Like students have to be able to name things, and you have to be able to name things. And I think knowing that the ethnic studies community is there, hopefully can empower all of us to just feel more confident that like, hey, we can, you have to talk politics in your classroom. You have to talk about the ideologies that are at play, and you should know that there's a community behind you. So like if someone does come for you, then you have a community that will fight for you. And I feel like for ethnic studies moving forward in Boston, building relationships to kind of, I think Jeremy touched on this, like the many material struggles that are connected to ethnic studies, right? So like we're obviously fighting for ethnic studies, and we're also fighting for housing justice. We're also fighting for, no more police in Boston public schools, which apparently is happening, but who knows how it'll go down. Or defunding the police in Boston more generally, or more broader, like global struggles as well. So I think making those connections is going to be really valuable for us moving forward.
To go off of that, I think connections with other teachers who are teaching ethnic studies has been really helpful, and not something that I would have thought that I needed. And I keep talking about math, but it's because in my head today, like a math curriculum, it never changes. And I can teach what I taught last year and I can get feedback on it, but it probably won't change much. But like this year, I've gotten a lot of feedback and help from like Jeremy and Amrita and Katie on what I'm teaching, how I could teach it better, like where my students are at in the moment and how I can get them to the next step. So I think having a community of people to support and help and give feedback, I wouldn't have thought that I needed, but has been really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I feel like honestly, part of I think what like the process of like doing this work has really been helpful and supporting too is like um really making some things tangible in terms of like um really being able to sufficiently understand to the point where that can be taught. I think honestly too, straight up is like a lot of people have general understandings of like race and racism, or even kind of like the conditions that we all experience in terms of capitalism, things like that. But honestly, until you're in a position where you have to engage, you have to teach, not just young people, but adults. Like those are situations where I think there's like these huge possibilities for really like growing and developing. And I think part of that is just like, again, like you have to have this kind of like humility in terms of like basically being at peace with the fact that you you don't know that much when it comes down to it, no matter how old you are essentially, and you have to be engaged in this process. And I think that's something that comes up all the time, is that it's like the learning that we really haven't done is something that is a necessity in terms of like really being able to do ethnic studies. You know, I'm pro book 100%, pro reading 100%. I feel like I couldn't even tell you what I've learned since the pandemic started, honestly. You know, it's like I've known a lot of words, like, you know, I've read things in the past, but until I've gone back and done those things again, or picked up new resources and really tried to get deep into it, you know, if I was honest, I could say that the things that I thought I knew 10 years ago, I definitely didn't know. You know what I mean? I couldn't teach it. And I've done that work. It's like doing that work with a 10-year-old, a 12-year-old, an 18-year-old, a 40-year-old. Like you've been doing those things at different levels for months now. Um, and yeah, I don't know. I mean, that. I think that's just something that it's like it's. I couldn't articulate it enough. It's like you got to read. Like I can't tell anybody that enough. Where it's like you're not gonna just intuitively know certain things. Like you really do have to be somebody who's invested in reading and learning constantly. I mean, that's something that's been affirmed for me over and over again. You know, I mean, it's like essentially like we can know that things are messed up, but it's like knowing the how and the why and what to do is something that we really have to like get into for our you know, our spaces that we're trying to cultivate. But yeah, I couldn't I couldn't even like I can't even summarize like how much, you know, um my like, you know, comprehension of certain things has developed or grown just in terms of understanding like the just the bare basics to talk about what race is to a 12-year-old, you know, to talk about what racism is to a 10-year-old, or talk about what anti-blackness is to a 40-year-old. Like all those things are things that I thought I could do, and you know, I'm still getting there, still trying to figure out the best way to do it. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
I think also like building off of your point, Jeremy, around like constantly being in a space of like learning, always being comfortable with like how much you don't know. I think that's like one of the, 'cause I think one part of the question too was like one of the things that, you know, we've had a hard time with in terms of like implementing and doing ethnic studies. And I think even in terms of just like how much information that, I mean, even I have had to take in and learn about all these different aspects, all these different parts of our community, our diaspora, just to be able to like on a very basic level discuss, you know, the difference between like race, ethnicity, nationality, which obviously becomes like of prime importance, just 101 engaging anything in a classroom that's majority Black and Afro descended. So I feel like that has been like a not a learning curve, but that's been something that's like constantly I'm having to like grow with, learn. Never, ever is it over? And so I feel like that's like a thing that has been a little bit difficult.
Thanks. So I'm gonna just open it up. Amrita reminded me that this is until 6:30 and not 7. In my brain, it was until 7. Just wondering if there's anyone in the audience that has, I feel like been a little selfish in being able to ask the questions of these folks, or even I'm curious about if any of you in the panel have things to ask of each other, right, in the space. So don't feel like you just need to grab questions from the audience. I'm gonna remove all spotlights. Go ahead.
I guess I can ask a question. Hi, everyone. This is Somi. Well, first, just like thanks for doing all of this amazing work to bring ethnic studies into BPS. I'm a BPS parent. I have a sophomore or 10th grader and a 4th grader. And then, you know, I'm going to be an incoming teacher. My husband's a teacher, a BPS teacher. And so just like, I know it's a massive amount of work that you all have done to make this happen. So that's amazing. And just curious about, you know, some of the decisions that you all made together that were, you know, part of what became the curriculum for this year, or what you all have right now. I know there's like a lot of abolition work that's being done. And I feel like there's a lot of really great like curriculum, and I wasn't sure like if you guys were looking at that as well as, you know, kind of looking at other material, just kind of like how you guys formed like material, like discussions, and, you know, came to, because I'm sure it was like difficult, right? to figure out what to pick and choose as the kind of backbone and like texts and, you know, facilitation, materials, all that stuff. So yeah, just if anybody wanted to talk about that process.
I mean, maybe I could actually jump in on this one. I feel like honestly, I'm gonna be real, is that like so I was part of the little group of people that really kind of stuck around to put together the ninth grade course. But one of the things that really stands out actually is that there are things available to kind of give you an idea of like what an ethnic studies course looks like in a public school district. But a lot of people actually do not share, the recipe. Essentially, like it's one of those things that you have to kind of piece together and figure out, and really just like kind of like apply the process of praxis to in a lot of ways. But even in terms of abolition, I mean, abolition specifically, it's it's interesting. There's been this like, a lot of shifts in terms of education. Um, I think with a lot of people really being more comfortable with certain things that were not necessarily on the table before, at least to talk about. Maybe not necessarily to do, but to talk about. But a lot of materials are actually honestly just not available. Like that would be the truth, is that a lot of people have found ways to monetize their work, which, I'm not saying for or against, but I'm just saying that if something is essentially supposed to be bought by a district for hundreds or thousands of dollars, like we don't know what it looks like. So I think for like a lot of the work we had to do was kind of piecing together based on our own experiences in the classroom, our own teaching, our own networks. Um, we did have the benefit of like consultation, with which was like, a person that was hired by the person in the social studies department we were initially working with, at least for a while. But again, that relationship ends after the contract expires, and we got to continue to figure out how to put this thing together. Um, so yeah, honestly, I feel like it'd be misleading to think that there's actually a lot out there, because trust me, we've looked, like we've dug, begged for anything we could to kind of even just see what ethnic studies courses look like, and really, that was oftentimes not a possibility. You can get an idea, but you can't get everything. Um, but yeah, I mean, in terms of like even putting together the course, I think there's like some fundamental pieces that have to come with it essentially. And it's like you have to talk about identity. You can't not. So again, we structure around identity. We also have to talk about oppression, honestly. People try to coat that up whatever way they want, but that's something we have to articulate and talk about one way or the other. And then really it's not just about talking about it, but we have to have a piece that's about actually addressing it. So it's like we don't talk about things that are not fun or depressing, for no reason. It's really to be able to kind of expose these things and then go through the process of figuring out how to solve them or imagining solutions to those things. Um, those pieces are always essential. I think that's what makes it different in a lot of ways than, let's say, even like a history course. Because I feel like in ethnic studies, honestly, it's like if you don't provide students with an idea or the possibility of addressing issues confronting their community, then you're not doing it. And I think a lot of us in different ways have had experiences doing those things with students in different spaces, or doing those things with community and young people. And all those things were beneficial in terms of the curriculum development. Um, but yeah, I mean, even like whatever, like resources, I think one of the benefits too, honestly, is that, between the people involved with this, like we do have a big network, but it's also like having people with, diverse experience. So like Katie, I think mainly has taught students that are like, eighth grade plus. I've mainly taught students that are like, from kindergarten to fourth grade, and then fifth grade, and then sixth grade. Gabby works with younger children. Amrita works with like a diverse population of English language learners. Like a lot of teachers, like, in doing the work, we've cultivated resources. So I think that's like one of the things that, ultimately is beneficial, is that we have like a diverse experiences. I mean, really a lot of the people that came to the work were, dedicated in a way to even just figure out how to like put together a course, how to put together curriculum. And that probably means more than anything, honestly. That's more than a consultant. That's more than like, whatever money you could throw at, one of these like, um, nonprofits or something to put something together. Like having people with the will to do it, that'll take you to the moon and back for sure.
I'll just add to that because, I've been with Jeremy, part of like this like very iterative process, right? Where it feels like praxis is really the center of our work, like in terms of like the cyclical cycle of trying to figure out what it is that we need to work on, trying to do it, trying to evaluate it, like just this cycle that we keep going through. And I think that, what Jeremy's saying is like the people that are dedicated to doing that together in community has been the core of this, right? And so like, even when we started offering like these trainings, folks from California and Minnesota were joining us. They were like, there's nothing available that's free. Like they're just like, oh my God, there's no ethnic studies class unless I go pay a few $1,000s to university, and so that's real, right? And so, and that, the other thing that I might add is that when we started writing the curriculum, we were actually hired to write separate curriculums. Jeremy, I don't know if you remember this, like we were hired to write like an Asian American Studies course, an Indigenous Studies, actually, we didn't even have Indigenous Studies, but like a Latin American Studies course, I think what they called it, like African American Studies course, like, and in that process, we said, that doesn't really make sense. And we have to make sure that, like, yes, there are different ways in which those are taught. And yet there has to be an overarching framework that each of those classes also hold center, right? So that you actually have to have a common definition of race and racism. You actually have to have a common definition of white supremacy, all those things, right? Like were things that I think, and we just happen to have folks like that were pretty grounded in sort of like their own understanding of their own communities to be a part of that group. I think that in some ways it was luck, and folks who are willing to sort of continue to build, right? And that we want to make it available to folks, right? Like that we actually don't want to monetize this. This is like has been number one in our brains since the beginning. We've never wanted to monetize this. We've always wanted to make it open to anyone, not just Boston people. Okay, so it is a little bit close to the end. Maybe we'll just go around real quick and just say like a word of where we're at right now for folks who are left. Most of us are panelists, but that's okay. They've recorded this for perpetuity. Thanks, Natalia, for that. But maybe just a word of where you're at, and then we'll close out the space.